this is going to be a winter that's going to be remarkable for the way it changes the bourbon that comes out.
Why's that?
How mild it is.
Because it's so mild. We
Yeah.
never hit a real hard cold. It takes at least usually 2 weeks to fluctuate temperature of a warehouse.
Mm-hmm.
So you really need 2 weeks of below 50 degrees to get it to convert across one season to the next. So right now we're skipping a year.
Yeah.
So it's going to be interesting.
Hey everyone, it's a brand new month and we are kicking off a new segment we are calling Back to Basics. Yes, we've gone on far too long about the secondary nonsense and behind the scenes information that we've neglected the very thing that brought us into this world, the bourbon itself. So get ready for the next few episodes where we get back to the basics and focus on the process, the art, the craft, and even the laws that make this spirit the enjoyable juice that we all have grown to love. This episode kicks things off by getting into 101 and 201 level knowledge. I can guarantee you're going to learn something about bourbon that you never knew before. That being said, remember that this is a listener-supported podcast, so your sponsorships go a long way in keeping this podcast alive. Please consider being a sponsor and donate as little as $1 a month at patreon.com. That's patreon.com/Bourbon Pursuit. Enjoy this week's episode.
From their bar to yours, Chad and Sarah of the popular YouTube channel It's Bourbon Night bring you their favorite at-home old-fashioned mix with the new Elemental Elixir's Golden Hour Syrup. It's a custom-made syrup with notes of bold black tea, warm spices, and orange zest. All you need is your favorite whiskey and ice. No bitters needed. One bottle makes 16 drinks, so that's only $1 a cocktail before you add your own whiskey. They can also be enjoyed in other cocktails or spirits, mocktails, coffee, tea, and anything you can think of. It's crafted locally in Lexington, Kentucky, and you can get your bottle now at whiskeyambitions.com.
Play Whiskey Wednesday, Round 11, the memory game. Until June 26, each week you could win one of our 12 incredible grand prizes. Select 2 doors at checkout, and if they match on drawing night, you'll win that bottle. Not a match? No worries. You still score a Weller 12-year. Every $5 ticket gives you 5 chances to win, including 4 weekly bonus prizes. Get your tickets now at give270.org. Charitable Gaming License ORG 0002703.
Ed Bly and Rising Tide Spirits are back again with a new release of Old Stubborn Bourbon. And this release of Old Stubborn is a premium hand marriage of 10, 11, and 12-year cask strength, barely filtered pot still bourbon. It comes in at a staggering 123.8 proof. And the flavoring grain for this one, which the last one was wheated, but this time it's now rye. Rich, sweet, and bold with a long finish that's sure to be another eye-opener. You can order online at Sealbox or thebourbonconcierge.com. And you can even purchase in person at Revival Vintage Spirits, and even now with very few select stores in Kentucky. You can get it now while you can, but be sure to do it because it's not going to last long. Do you ever pour yourself a bourbon, swirl it around, and then start struggling to come up with tasting notes? And perhaps you're also looking for a good Father's Day gift idea. Well, you can now solve both with a kit from Knows Your Bourbon. And unlike other nosing kits on the market, Knows Your Bourbon kits feature real ingredients for the most authentic aromas. You can smell real Tahitian vanilla bean instead of some synthetic aroma that's just made from chemicals. So head on over to knowsyourbourbon.com and enter code BP10 for 10% off your order. Always find what you love at Total Wine & More. With so many great bottles to choose from at the lowest price, it's easy to find your favorite Cabernet or a new single barrel bourbon to try, with some help from one of their friendly guides. And with every bottle comes the confidence of knowing you just found something amazing. With the lowest prices for over 30 years, find what you love and love what you find only at Total Wine & More. Curbside pickup and delivery available in most areas. Visit TotalWine.com to learn more. Spirits not sold in Virginia and North Carolina. Drink responsibly and be 21.
Welcome back to the episode of the Bourbon Pursuit podcast. Kenny and Ryan are here today in the studios here in Louisville, Kentucky.
Yep.
Yeah,
our famous studio.
Our famous studio.
Kitchen table.
Dining room table. Let's get it right.
No soundproofing.
Yeah, exactly. So we're doing our best with what we have, but this is our kickoff to what we and Ryan had come up with as coined as Newbies Month, and I guess kind of give an introduction to, what we're going to expect this month.
Yeah, so we're trying to get back to basics. In this bourbon game, you kind of get consumed by special releases, hunting, like always going for the rare, and you kind of forget, there's a lot of fun and enjoyment about the basics of bourbon, and we're trying to just get back to that for our listeners, because I've personally gotten burned out on special releases and everything. So I'm excited to go back and dive deep into why we got here in the first place.
I know, because I feel like we're almost losing you a little bit because
I know I'm going off to rum. I'm like, now I'm buying some wine, but no, I'm staying here.
You're not gonna completely give out on this.
No, I'm still getting my Heaven Hill 6 year and all that. Just staying with the basics this year.
Good, yeah. That's what I'm really. I'm glad we're going to be able to do this because, like you said, I think we contribute to a problem, but hopefully this kind of also really gets a lot of the, I guess you could say, the education down that we can have recorded. It's perpetual. It's out there, and you can listen to it as much as you want. And you can share it along and make sure that if anybody wants to get into bourbon, be like, you go and you listen to this episode, and there's your base for it. So
exactly.
So very happy to introduce our guest today. So today we have Tim Knittel. Tim is a bourbon educator at distilled-living.com and a certified Stave and Thief Society executive bourbon steward. So Tim, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
I did say
excited to be here.
I said your last name correct.
You actually got it right without even asking before the show, which is fantastic.
I felt like I was going to make like a cardinal sin of podcasting is not asking how to say the last name before we started. But
you nailed it.
Yeah, all right, fantastic. So Tim, again, welcome to the show. And just to give everybody an idea, so today is going to be really an introduction to bourbon. This is going to be Bourbon 101, Bourbon 201. What really makes what we're here, what we've, I guess, gone crazy over, all the bourbon nuts out there that are listening, like make you understand why you're listening to this. And I can guarantee you're going to learn something that you didn't know before. So Tim,
I'm ready to be stumped.
Yeah. So before we dive into that, let's set up the base here. So Tim, kind of talk about who you are, how you got into bourbon, all this other kind of good stuff.
Sure. So I've been in Kentucky most of my life, but I never got into bourbon in my drinking days, like in the beginning. I got into wine. I was managing a wine bar. I was going through that. After that closed, some buddies of mine decided they wanted to get me into bourbon. So they sat me down. I ordered the sushi. They brought a bottle. They poured it for me. I took a sip and I was like, whoa. I was like, it's hot. Sorry. And I
good
kind of
try.
stopped.
Good try.
Yeah. So my introduction wasn't the best. But then I was working for Weta Michael, who's a local celebrity chef down in Central Kentucky in Lexington. And when she became the chef in residence at Woodford Reserve, I moved over there with her. So my real first introduction was under the tutelage of a James Beard nominated chef and the master distiller for Woodford Reserve. That's when I learned how to taste it. That's when I learned how to get into the deep flavors. That's when I learned about the product, and I got really, really excited about it. So I spent several years there managing the culinary program. Eventually, Brown-Forman created a job for me at the distillery doing brand education work and bourbon education work. It was a great deal of fun. And then a year ago, I created my own business and went independent. So now I get to talk about all brands and bourbon generally. And I do a lot of writing.
Your real opinions now?
I get to give my real opinions. My real opinion is still Woodford Reserve is excellent. That hasn't changed any. But I get to talk favorably about everybody. Not that I didn't talk favorably about everybody beforehand, but now I get to put everybody on an equal pedestal, which is great. And I do writing for a bunch of different outlets. I do consulting for distilleries and bars, helping them get into bourbon and connect with bourbon consumers.
So talk a little bit more about Distilled-Living and what you do with your company.
Yeah. So first and foremost, I've been doing a lot of writing. What's surprising to me was that was such a big piece of industry desire right at the moment. And there's a lot of people getting into bourbon more every day. I feel like the bourbon enthusiast bubble is nowhere near breaking. It's just growing and growing. And people are getting into the category, but need basic education around it. Need to know who the big players are in the industry, one of the biographies of people behind the scenes. So I've been doing a lot of that. And I'm just launched a 4-part series for Artisan Spirit magazine, helping distilleries reach those consumers. But the rest of my time in Lexington is spent doing private bourbon education. there's actually a big demand for it. So we have a lot of corporations that come in. They want to showcase Central Kentucky to the VIPs, the C-level guys that are coming in. They want to do a bourbon tasting. They need somebody to come and sit down with them and guide them through the process of learning about Kentucky's spirit and learning how to taste the flavors behind it, understanding what it is. I do bus rides in between distilleries, so there's something to talk about. I help give background and provide more information than the distilleries are able to provide during our limited time with them. So I can answer a lot of questions that people have when we're in the isolated setting of the bus as well. And that's a big chunk of what I do.
Do you do that for like the public transportation system? You get on there and you're like, next stop.
And we'll have a little, where's your ticket? Here's your sample. That'd be fantastic. No, I wish I could. But I do a lot of private functions.
Right, absolutely. So what about like private functions? If I was hosting something here at my house and I needed somebody to come in and for like entertain my 10 or 15 guests that I'm going to have here, do you do something like that as well?
Absolutely. Just like wine sommeliers have done for a long time, doing home wine dinners, I do home bourbon dinners.
Kenny would never do that. He's a know-it-all. He was like, I don't need an expert.
I don't do the cooking, but there are a lot of people, who are trying to get into bourbon, and a lot of locals, that's been a big surprise for me. I thought a lot of my work would be with people who were outside of Kentucky, tourists or people coming in for conferences and things. But a lot of people who have grown up in this state and are used to drinking bourbon or aren't used to drinking bourbon and want to get into it because it's so hot now, still don't have a handle on what it is. So my Bourbon 101 classes and my other regular public ticketed classes at various venues around Lexington, a lot of those are focused on locals learning what bourbon is.
Okay. I had a question. It might be slightly off topic, but you said you were working with distilleries about working with guests and stuff. Mm-hmm. And with some of the law changes, distilleries are now going to be able to like serve more alcohol, let you sell more. And it seems like a lot of distilleries are building enhanced visitor experience. Like, can you talk about like how, I guess they're trying to become more like Napa in the sense that it's not just go to the tour and that's it.
Yeah, it's been an enormous change in the industry over the last 10, 15, 20 years. So, we started in a place, people may not be able to remember, but we started in a place where it was primarily just Maker's Mark offering a really publicized visitor experience. And even then they couldn't sell their product back in the day. And over time, we've gained the ability to sell bottles out of the distillery gift shops, ultimately have samples. Some places still don't have samples 7 days a week. Sundays are going to be off limits, but most places can do a little bit of a samples. Last year, the law changed. Senate Bill 11 came in. Instead, we moved from 1 ounce of total sample to 1.75 ounces. So that's a pretty hefty amount of sampling that you can do. But it also said that you could effectively have a bar at a distillery. Now, there are some constraints around it compared to a regular bar, but it does create the all-day type experience that you have Napa and Sonoma. And that's absolutely what it's been modeled after. The success that those valleys have had in creating a tourism scene and making it very valuable for the wineries there has been the inspiration for the way we've developed out bourbon tourism in Kentucky. So being able to go to a distillery, do the tour, that's 45 minutes or whatever, do a sample, it takes another 15. You maybe spend 20 minutes in the gift shop, or you can sit on the porch, you can get a cocktail, or you can get a larger neat pour. You can spend more time talking to the employees and the owners. And locals can come and hang out and get a drink, after work. It's completely changed the way people are thinking about the distillery's relationship to the community and to tourism. I think it's just been generally a great thing. I did an interview with the folks down at Barrel House about that particular topic a couple months back, and that their new bar is opening very soon, called Elkhorn, and they're expecting their profitability increase and their cash flow increase to be able to double their operations. They're going to get another still, they're going to get more fermenters, they're moving everything around. So it's great for them as an example moving forward.
Yeah, super excited about that, because when you go, like you said, you only spend like 20 minutes at the store and then you're like, oh, on to the next one. Now you can sit with your wife, maybe listen to a band, have a full bar, enjoy it. So I'm super excited about that.
Yeah, and it won't just be the bourbons that they sell. There'll be, options for wine, for gin, for beer. So if you're doing a big group coming through Kentucky, not everyone has to be a super bourbon enthusiast, or maybe you've hit your palate limit for the day and you need something a little lighter to carry you through until you've hit your restaurant destination for dinner. That's great options.
Exactly.
So I guess that's a good segue. So let's go ahead and just jump into it. So let's go ahead and start with the Bourbon 101 knowledge. So I guess let's kind of jump into it. What do you kind of start off with a class? Because if I'm going to come in and I'm brand new to this, I say, well, what is bourbon?
Yeah, well, I like to throw it back on the audience. So I like to open my classes and say, does anybody know what bourbon is? Can anybody tell me what it is?
I do.
All right. All right, bring it out for us.
It's a 51% corn mash bill.
All right.
Has to be aged 2 years in a new white oak charred barrel. And what are the 10 commandments?
It has to be made in America.
Made in America.
Oh, we got the made in America one. That's unusual. That one doesn't hit often.
We prefer it to be made in Kentucky. First and foremost, but
that's a good one. Not a law, but definitely a preference.
Yeah.
All right. So we hit a couple of things there, and that's usually how it goes. Usually, even at the bigger crowd, different people are going to throw out different things. Unfortunately, there's some myths in there. There's some inaccuracies. So we're going to walk through the whole thing. What I like to do is first position bourbon in the hierarchy of beverage alcohol. Right. So that's our foundation. Bourbon is a form of beverage alcohol. It's great. Everybody usually can
get you drunk.
Yeah. Yeah, most people can establish that pretty quickly, pretty easily. And when you look at beverage alcohol, all drinkable alcohol that we have comes from yeast fermenting sugar. We've never found a way to synthesize alcohol in the lab in any way. So your sugar source defines your initial beverage category. So grapes make wine, grains make beer. It's a great way of starting thinking about it. Now you can add to that production process another step, and that's distillation. So you distill wine, you get brandy. Very easy, very simple. You distill beer and you stick it in an oak container and you get whiskey at its most basic. And there are different regional laws and there are different, international trade agreement laws, and there's a lot of different things around it. But at its most basic, you ferment some grains, you run it through a still to separate the alcohol and some of the water from all the solids and the majority of the water. You stick it in oak, you get whiskey. So bourbon is a category of whiskey. It's technically an adjective. We use it like a noun. You go into a bar, you order a bourbon, but bourbon whiskey. Like we have Scotch whiskey, Irish whiskey, Canadian whiskey, wheat whiskey, rye whiskey, light whiskey, corn whiskey. We have bourbon whiskey. That's why you always see it written that way on a bottle. So then we've positioned it that way. Then we look at the rules around bourbon, and its production processes kind of go hand in hand, and they're helpful to understand each other together. I like to frame everything in the way Mike Veach talks about with his 6 sources of flavor. So he talks about water, grains, fermentation, distillation, maturation in the barrel, and then finally presentation, how you batch it, how you bottle it. Now, there's no rule around water. A lot of times people will say something like, oh, it has to come from limestone water. It doesn't.
No, I've seen the reverse osmosis machines in all the distilleries.
Exactly. Once upon a time, everyone used limestone aquifer water here in Kentucky because it was pure. And as the purity level has dropped, we've had to move to the reverse osmosis. But we start with water. Water can contribute negative flavor. That's why everybody reverse osmosis is their water. To do a real fun tasting, if you're here in Kentucky, get yourself some distilled water or reverse osmosis or highly purified water. Get yourself some old limestone water, which is, it's meant as to add a splash to bourbon. I thought it was kind of a joke at first until I tried it. And pour yourself some water out of the tap. Taste those 3 side by side, and you can see limestone water has an amazing, wonderful flavor. But if you don't have wonderful, high quality limestone water, you drop back to your reverse osmosis, to your purified. But that's where you're going to start because you don't want to introduce any negative flavors into your bourbon.
Is there anybody that's still doing limestone, or is that just kind of like a fad of old times that was necessarily a thing? Because I mean, to be honest, that's one thing that I'm already kind of getting busted on. As I was in my head, I was just like, oh yeah, Kentucky limestone water, like that's what makes Kentucky bourbon so great. Because I always heard the thing that said like, oh, and that's why Kentucky breeds better horses because there's more calcium in limestone water. Like
absolutely true. I mean, that's part of the story too. What I know of right now is Woodford Reserve is using 100% aquifer water at their distillery. The law is if water breaks the surface, it has to be processed in some way. So they dug a well and actually broke into the aquifer underneath the property. So they're able to use that directly. When I was down there, I tried to get access to it and they wouldn't let me have it. Because I was like, oh, we should taste this. This is amazing. This is going to be wonderful. They're like, well, sometimes it has sulfur in it. Sometimes it has other things. So it's great for the yeast. It's great for making the bourbon. It's not great for drinking.
Gotcha. Yeah, my grandma, she lives out in the middle of central Kentucky and she has a well. And it's the ice is terrible. We have to bring our own ice because it tastes like shit.
It's true. That's why the old limestone drinking water is so great because they purified it just the right amount. They filtered out those things, but left that mineral content, and you really get to experience it. That's a good question. So we use the water to cook the grains. Now, any whiskey can use any set of grains. Usually, it's malted barley, but for bourbon, as Ryan, you mentioned earlier, minimum 51% corn. You could have 100% corn bourbon if you wanted to, but this stuff is unwieldy. It's difficult to work with. It really provides the starch in the backbone that becomes the alcohol and not a lot of the flavor. But from our rules perspective, minimum 51% corn within our 100% grain recipe. So
who decided that? Why not 50%, 49% corn? Why were they saying it had to be the majority grain?
When bourbon was being formalized in the TTB and being codified, what they did was they looked at historical research, and they were trying to define an existing category already in the marketplace, and to differentiate it from rye whiskey, they said majority grain corn versus majority grain rye.
Gotcha.
That's why one of the reasons those two products are so similar, except for the majority grain. There are a couple of the distinctions. We can get into those or not. This is about bourbon, but
right.
But that's why it went to corn, because corn had historically been used to make a product called bourbon already existing in the market. The rules came much later. The production processes all came first, and it wasn't formalized until later on. All right, so now we ferment our grains and do a product called the distiller's beer, really easy to follow. Now we're going to send that on to distillation. So distillation is the process of separating alcohol, water molecules, and certain flavors and sending them forward in the production process and leaving behind everything we don't want. There's a lot of off flavors in fermentation, so we leave those. Now, working with any alcoholic beverages, if you distill your beverage above 190 proof or 95% alcohol by volume, what you have coming off the stills becomes odorless, colorless, tasteless, and that's how you make vodka. So that is that set of spirits. For any whiskey generally, you keep it below the vodka range, below 95% alcohol.
Well, how do you do that, I guess? Because once you're distilling, like what's can you just add water to it at that point? Or is there a certain...
there's a control valve or something?
That's a great question. It depends on if you're using a pot still or a column still. So in a pot still, when you started at the beginning of the process, you heat up the liquids and solids that are in the bowl of the still, and the vapors start to come out the top, starts to evaporate. It's going to be 0% alcohol at the beginning. It's just the water right at first. And over time, your alcohol percentage raises, and then you hit a kind of a peak where the most alcohol is coming out, and then it starts to fall. And different pot stills get to different points. A pot still can get above 160 proof. It can get to 170 proof, during the highest point of the run, and still not have your aggregate come out above 160. So you can still make bourbon that way. I was down at Bluegrass Distillers, and they were peaking right around 160 proof at the moment when we were talking about their still, when we were looking at it and tasting off of it. And their whole run comes in around 115, 120. because at the beginning, prior to that peak, and then afterwards for a little while, they're going to be at a lower alcohol percentage coming off the still. With a column still, it's a little bit different. It's a little more complicated. But in terms of the rate that you introduce your liquid into the still, the amount of steam, the pressure, you're going to have your vapor come off at different levels. So, and then usually with any distillations, with any alcoholic beverage, your first distillation is low, and you need to run at least a second or a third. This is why vodkas have claims about how many hundreds of times they've been distilled. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Because you need to keep redistilling the same thing to get it to those really high percentages. So for bourbon, single distillation is possible. Most people do double distillation to get it wherever they want it. Anywhere from 115 proof to 158 proof is typically your range that people go, but never above 160. That's the law.
Is that second time to be able to distill something much easier to do than the first time because of, basically like everything's kind of already up there and you kind of just, okay. So it's
because of everything.
Okay.
Typically you don't have the solids in there after the first distillation. Most people, distill from mash the first time. And so it's much easier the second time. It's going to heat much more evenly and much less risk of scorching. It's going to run much faster because you're starting out with a concentrated liquid. You're leaving behind just the water and flavors that you want to leave behind, which is going to be a smaller overall percentage. So the whole thing runs faster and runs easier.
Okay. So there is an economy of scale to this of why they do it and stuff like that, because it does get cheaper as you distill it more times.
Well, it doesn't. The run gets cheaper. You're spending less energy on the run, and you're getting a higher proof product. So you're getting concentrated alcohol, which you're paying taxes on as a distiller. So you want to get it as high as you are comfortable with, to maximize the amount that you're going to have going into the barrel. Now, nothing of that is ever lost. It's just about how many times you have to run your still to get all of your fermented liquid into a distillation state.
Okay. And most are about a two times for column stills or two. And then I guess kind of like speak a diagram, if you will. Like, how does that work? Does it go into a holding tank and then it kind of goes again, does it? Or is it like
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Yep. It goes into a receiver is usually what they call it. It's usually behind a wall somewhere because it's not, the big glorious still. Mm-hmm. And it's a receiving tank. And then they'll have, they call it different things. It's after a stripping run. They might call it first run spirits. They might call it low wine. That's a common industry term. That'll be the result of that first distillation. And then the second time through usually is called new spirit. That's the most common term that people use.
And that's what you see when people are, drinking it off the still, or you have the pretty box with all the white dog going through. That's what you're seeing. You never really get to see that first run go through those.
And you really don't want to. I mean, that can contain corn oil, which at that point is going to be burnt. Potentially even a little bit of sulfur will pass through on that first still run. Maybe even solids, some of the lighter solids.
You can stop there. That's
all right. We're talking about bourbon. We're not talking about the stuff that we leave behind in the process.
You don't like to chew your bourbon? Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
No.
Very, very
why do
pulpy.
people? I think I sort of know, but I guess with a column versus a pot still, why would they use one versus the other?
The column.
I know it's real complicated, but maybe like a condensed down.
All right. So it comes down to economies and efficiencies. So a pot still is super inefficient, requires a lot of manual control, has to be observed, very subject to weather and ambient temperature, especially the larger your column still, the more surface area it has, the more it's going to be, it's going to run hot in the summer and cold in the winter. I mean, that's how pot stills work. But they're cheaper to buy, they're cheaper to maintain, and they're cheaper to run because you can start one whenever you've got your 6 or 8 hours that you have of time to run the thing. And then when you're done, you're done. A column still, because it's a continuous process rather than the batch process of a pot still, a column still really needs to be a high volume operation. Your big boys are going to be the ones who are going to invest in that. And typically, if you have a column still, you start it up Monday morning and you run it 24/7 until Sunday night, and then third shift Sunday cleans it. and then you start it again Monday morning. You want to give it a continuous high volume supply of fermented mash into the column still, because you don't ever want it to stop having liquid, because then you have to shut it down and start it again. And you need to have a continuous supply of steam. But your efficiency and your consistency of quality is much easier on a column still.
Gotcha.
They do produce different flavor profiles. The column still usually winds up stripping more out of it than a pot still, especially your real small pot stills. So you get varying flavor profiles and intensities based on which one you're using.
So is there, I guess you could say, a big bias to people say like, oh, a column still is not as flavorful or front forward as a pot still? Or is that just kind of like I don't know, like as you said, it's more about an efficiency mechanism more or less than it is a lot of the taste that goes into it.
Column still is more consistent, or they're able to control it more.
Yeah, column still is definitely easier to make consistent. It's not that you can't make a pot still consistent, but it's going to be a lot harder. There's bourbon has its share of snobbery around it, essentially. Yeah, and so there are people who are like, oh, I don't like column still stuff. It strips too much. But you can run a column more gently. It's possible to get more flavor out of it, keep it a little bit lower. On the other hand, there's something to be said for stripping it really, really intensely and getting most of your flavor from the barrel. There's a lot of quality that can come out of that way. So it just depends on what the distiller wants. There's no right or wrong answer with it either way.
All right, cool. Let's move on. I think we beat this still thing to death.
All right, so now it's distilled. All right, we talked at the beginning of the show about new charred oak barrel. Big piece of bourbon. Most people who are into bourbon a little bit know that piece. Now, the law says oak container. It doesn't specify barrel. Barrel is the convention for the container, and its size, usually around 53 gallons. It has to be made of oak. That is specified in the law. It's almost redundant. I mean, we are seeing people experiment nowadays with alternate woods, but you've got to use oak because oak is really the only wood that holds liquid. Once you make it into a barrel, if you're using most other woods, you're not going to have a barrel, you're going to have a sieve. So if you want to drink anything afterwards, it's got to be the oak. New means it's never been used to hold anything. Unlike any other whiskey, any other product in the world, bourbon has to be new, and it has to be charred. So charring is where they set the barrel on fire on the inside, let it burn for a little while. That process exposes the flavors that are in the wood and allows them to become soluble into liquid that you put into the wood. If you skip the charring step and you have raw green wood, you put liquid into it, it'll never develop any additional flavor. It won't develop its amber color. It's just going to be kind of bland.
Now, is a wine barrel like that? They don't, I guess, since they don't char it.
Wine barrels are still heat processed. They're still toasted in some way. It's the difference between toasting and charring is toasting is going to be a radiant heat at a lower temperature, usually around 400 to 600 degrees, although people do different things. It's kind of like taking the element out of your oven and sticking it inside the barrel, cranking it up to maximum. That still has to be done to break down the tannins and the lignans and the other flavors that are in there. Charring is kind of a fast process. Provides heat at about 15 to 1800 degrees. And it provides combustion onto those oak sugars. So we get more caramels, butterscotches, burnt sugar flavors. It also exposes more vanillins. So we get more vanilla flavor by burning it, by charring it, rather than the toasting it like the wine barrels do.
So typically when we talk about the oak that goes into barrels, it's usually white oak, right? Mm-hmm. Because red oak, we can go into pretty much any home, people have hardwood floors, that's typically made out of red oak. Mm-hmm. Oak is a very strong wood, but red oak isn't typically used in barrels.
Right.
Why is that?
Yeah, there's nothing in the law that specifies white oak, but white oak holds liquid well. Red oak can be made into a barrel. Might hold liquid, might not. It's very technically difficult to work with because its cellular structure is different. It doesn't have the same water retention, liquid retention capabilities that white oak has naturally. So we just use white oak because it works. I mean, it's easy. There just simply isn't another wood that is the same as white oak.
Okay, so I guess, and then you kind of mentioned something a little bit ago about having like French oak. Like, so is I mean, I know there's a bunch of variations of oak, and there is experimentations, but I mean, I know oak is pretty much the predominant one. Have you heard of anything else that isn't oak that has held up to the test of time or been able to give the same characteristics or whatever it is?
No, there's just nothing that's the same. Every other wood that's ever been tried to use for beverage alcohol has been experimentations and limited releases. I mean, they occasionally, Woodford Reserve did a maple wood barrel finished version of their product. But it's, they would never release a primary product where the first barrel and the only barrel was maple wood. It's always going to be white oak as your base.
So I guess going into the barrel portion, right? I mean, you said an oak container, and now that I'm even going to ask the question, I think I'm already going to dispel it. Is like, when you think about the way that you store these barrels and these rick houses, it would almost make more sense to put them in boxes in regards to being able to have spatial pieces. But then I think like,
boxes don't roll.
Boxes don't roll.
But do we need them to roll? We have machines. We could put them on forklifts. We could put them on pallets. We could move them around. The difficulty is it would be nearly impossible to make a wood box, an oak box that holds liquid.
Without nails or glue, right?
Yeah. It's the shape of the barrel makes it seal. So it's a perfect container. I mean, it was developed, more than 2,000 years ago to hold liquid, to be able to transport it long distances. It works well. We've never found anything better.
So a lot of people think that the oak does everything. Like it doesn't matter all beforehand. It's what you put in and let the oak do its magic. So how important is to you think?
Different people say different things. I think 60 to 80% of the flavor comes from the oak, from the where it's sourced, how the barrel is made, how it's handled during maturation, the climate, the number of years, all those factors. Those are your 60 to 80%. But it's possible to dispel that right now. You go into a big liquor store, you find a couple of different, White Dog products, and just taste them side by side. There, you'll be able to tell the difference right away in the initial distillates from different distilleries. It's really easy to pick them apart. Yeah, and to say, there is different flavors from previous places in the process.
Shopify's already taken the cash register online, helping millions sell billions around the world. But did you know that Shopify can do the same thing at your retail store? Give your point of sale system a serious upgrade with Shopify. Shopify's point of sale is your command center for your retail store. From accepting payments to managing inventory, Shopify has everything you need to sell in person. And with Shopify, you get a powerhouse selling partner that effortlessly unites your in-person and online sales into one source of truth. Track every sale across your business in one place and know exactly what's in stock. Connect with customers in-line and online. Shopify helps you drive store traffic with plug-and-play tools built for marketing campaigns, from TikTok to Instagram and beyond. And get hardware that fits your business. Take payments by smartphone. Transform your tablet into a point-of-sale system or use Shopify's point-of-sale Go mobile device for a battle-tested solution. Plus, Shopify's award-winning 24/7 help is there to support your success every step of the way. Do retail right with Shopify. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/bourbon, all lowercase, and go to shopify.com/bourbon to take your retail business to the next level today. Shopify.com/bourbon. If you're anything like me, then you can't get enough about bourbon. And that's why I'm a subscriber to Bourbon Plus magazine. Bourbon Plus is a quarterly publication that tells the stories from the heart of bourbon, the farmers who grow the grain, the distillers who labor over the process, and the people like you and me who raise their glasses to celebrate it all. Subscribe to Bourbon Plus magazine today at bourbonplus.com, that's PLUS.com, and use code PURSUIT at checkout for $5 off your subscription.
Okay, so let's kind of talk. Let's move on a little bit more. So, what's the next step in this journey?
Well, getting it into the barrel is a step. So there's another rule here, unique to bourbon. So your distillate can come off the still at up to 160 proof, but it must be cut using nothing but pure water to 125 proof maximum, or 62.5% alcohol, before you put it in that barrel. There's a lot of chemistry behind that. We're not going to go into the deep chemistry stuff here, but different solubility ratios depending upon your alcohol to water ratio and different things. But we got to keep it below 125 proof when it goes into the barrel.
You got to pay Tim to come to your house to be able to explain that part. Right?
Sure. Happy to. All right. Now, I think at the beginning we talked something about age or years. I can't remember if somebody said 2 years.
I said 2 years.
All right. There is nothing in the law on a minimum age for bourbon. As soon as it hits,
it must be the Bottle and Bond Act. Shit,
that's the Bottle and Bond Act. That's part of it. It's also straight. When the liquid, the distillate hits the new charred oak container, it is bourbon. You can bottle it up. Jimmy Russell has a great quote where he says, "You can take an oak bucket, char it, fill it up off your still, walk it over to the bottling line, bottle it up, and call it bourbon. You just can't reuse the bucket." And that's how it works. And so when you're maturing bourbon, there are ages that matter. And that's where people get confused around these rules and things. So at 2 years, you can apply the adjective straight. Now, straight means a whiskey has been in a new charred oak barrel at least 2 years, has no additives for color or flavor, and is the product of a single state. So you see that almost every bourbon label that you look at says Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey. That's because they've been aged at least 2 years and hit that mark. Anything less than 4 years of maturity has to declare an age statement on the label. So most of your bourbons are going to be greater than 4 years old. That's your maturity mark. Anything less than 4 years is generally considered an immature bourbon. That's why it would have to carry an age statement. You can kind of think of it as the reverse of Scotch. Scotch is the longer they're in barrels, the more proud they become of their age statement. So you see, if it's been in there 10, 12 years, it may or may not carry an age statement, but at 18, at 25 years, they're definitely going to. Bourbon is backwards. Once we hit 4 years, most places are pulling the age statements off of it. And it's up to the discretion of the distiller whether or not they want to put an age statement beyond that point.
Now, can they mix in, say they have 4-year barrel or 4-year bourbon in there, can they mix in 2 year with that and still call it a 4-year bourbon?
The youngest drop is the age of the product.
Okay.
So as soon as you put a 2-year-old product in there, even if it's 10, 20 years for the rest of it, that's a 2-year-old bourbon.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So then there's a set of rules that overlap with the straight rules. So bourbon, and this is totally unique to bourbon. No other spirit, no other beverage alcohol has this rule. No additives for color or flavor. It's guaranteed all natural product. Now that overlaps with straight. So a straight rye is going to have that same set of rules. But otherwise it's unique to bourbon. And then the final rule, and this is true for all whiskeys, is it must be bottled at not less than 40% alcohol or 80 proof. And then the other one you mentioned already was it must be a product of the United States.
Right. So I want to kind of go back to the, I guess you can say the 80 proof, 40%. Now, there was a time when there was a thing called like light whiskeys that distilleries were coming out with because there wasn't a fad and the barrel proof craziness that goes on now. But there was a time when I don't even know what the percentage was, but it was fairly low. So those weren't technically bourbons, but those were just still whiskeys at the time.
Right. And even those were not recognized in the international community as whiskeys because internationally, except in Australia and New Zealand, you've got to have a minimum 80 proof to call it whiskey. But for a period of time, the U.S. said, you know what, light whiskey, we'll release it for that category. We're kind of weird around our rules in the U.S. around everything. We're the only place that allows a whiskey called corn whiskey to not be matured. In fact, the rule for corn whiskey is it has to be at least 80% corn and either not matured in a barrel or matured in a used barrel. I think they call it used cooperage in the law. So there's all sorts of crazy near bourbon rules and near bourbon products.
So I kind of want to touch on that last one about, being made in America, but there's really nothing that's stopping anybody in Austria, New Zealand, or Russia or wherever from actually creating bourbon, right?
Oh, there is. There absolutely is. Yeah, our international trade agreements forbid it. The Kentucky Distillers Association really monitors that pretty heavily. And
well, what if they do all the same process, but they just don't put the word bourbon on it?
Then they have made a bourbon style whiskey.
Okay,
and they can't necessarily put that on the label, but they can explain that to consumers that they have met the whiskey rules, except for that one about making it in the USA.
So let's go back and touch on aging just a little bit. What would you say is the average that you would see in the market today? Is there there's always this, I guess we'll start, the first question is the average. And then the second is there's always people that say when they taste, they're like, oh, it's so over oaked. Is that a real thing?
Is that a real
What's
thing?
the happy spot?
Yeah. So that's, if you'd asked me that question 15 years ago, it'd be a lot easier to answer. But nowadays, we're seeing folks like Hartfield and Company, they use 5.8 gallon barrels. So their whiskey reaches a dark color in about 4 months and reaches the flavor profile they want very quickly. So that's an incredibly young bourbon. And then we're seeing, most of your big distilleries and most of your craft distilleries that can last that long want to get to the 4-year mark. That's just where maturity is when you're using the 53 gallon barrels. Everybody wants to put straight on there. It's a big deal. If you go to the Bluegrass Distillers website, they got a countdown timer for when they go straight, when they got their first 2-year product. From the big distilleries, really, they don't typically hit their stride until at least 5 or 6 years. I mean, that's just where most people are. I think the sweet spot for me, just with my palate, and other people are going to disagree with me, and that's fine. I think the sweet spot is somewhere around 7 to 9, 10 years. I just think that's where we get the most complexity of flavor, and it doesn't hit.
It's not 23.
I know, right? I'm not an older is better person. I'm not. It's the over-oaking thing. So there's a lot of chemistry that goes on inside barrel maturation. We don't even know all of it. We don't even understand all of it. But the wood itself is broken down by the water and by the alcohol, and it extracts flavors, and extracts good flavors and bad flavors. Evaporation occurs, airspace gets into the barrels, you get oxygen in there, oxygen starts to break things down, produces a whole host of other flavors. Over time in the barrel, there are two things that kind of rise, I think, negatively past a certain point, and that is your real intense fruitiness, almost to an overripe fruit. That's a flavor characteristic that can develop as the oxygen is just breaking down everything that's in there. When you think about, if you leave fruit out too long and it starts to rot, you can smell it from across the house. That's because it's releasing really short chain molecules. And the same thing can happen inside a barrel. And the over oaking thing is, as the liquid gets deeper into the wood and the wood breaks down more and more, you can pull these hard tannins and just harsh, almost like overbrewed black tea flavor notes out of it. It can kind of wind up tasting like sawdust at a certain point. There are sweet spots for bourbon, but everybody has their own taste. Some people, they swear by Pappy 23, and that's fine. Happy to have them in the market too.
Yeah, good luck to them.
Yeah, there's that.
So I guess another question back to the barrels. So 53 gallon barrels, pretty much a standard, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, what would make, as you said, Hartsfield Company, what would make somebody want to go and experiment with smaller barrels? Because we've actually had a few craft on, and they said they even tried experimenting with smaller barrels, and they just didn't find it really developed what they wanted. Is there even more chemistry that goes on to what's happening inside of a smaller barrel versus inside of a large barrel when you have more surface area but less product, or whatever it is?
Yeah, it changes your ratio of your chemistries. So you think about your first layer of chemistry is extraction from the barrel. The greater surface area you have, the faster your extraction. As a function of the volume of your liquid. The second piece would be evaporation. You're actually going to get faster evaporation, so you're going to get more headspace, and you get to your third set, which is the oxygenation and the oxygen breaking things down. The oxygen's breaking down the barrel and the liquid. different components that are in there. And that's a really critical step. And that's where people who turn away from the small barrels, that's really what they're looking at is they're not getting the oxygen into the barrels. They're not giving it the time to break down some of the harsh molecules, produce fruity characteristics that are very pleasant over time, help with creating the right vanilla notes. The time piece is separate from the extraction piece. In fact, if you look at a bourbon that's been in a 53-gallon barrel at 2 years and at 3 years, it's not a huge color change difference. By 2 years in, it's extracted a lot of color because that happens very quickly, but it won't have developed the nuanced character that most of the distillers are looking for in that period of time.
You know, one thing we didn't really hit on that we would be doing ourselves a disservice for the beginners is you got to talk about evaporation, what it's called, why it happens.
Yeah, we skipped right over that piece, didn't we?
All right. Yeah, and I was going to, go ahead.
All right, this is for me? Okay. So the evaporation. So you go down to the distillery and you're going to hear this every single time. This is the tour guide's favorite part. You walk into the warehouse, they open up the doors for you, you step across the threshold, and there's this beautiful aroma of the alcohol, the bourbon evaporating out. And they always say, does anybody know what that's called? And nobody puts their hand up, even if they've been on a tour 6 or 7 times. So they let the tour guide have their moment. The tour guide said, that's called the angel's share. We give the angels their share. We lose part of our product. But hopefully then the angels will come and look over our warehouses and make sure our product stays safe. So it's a term borrowed from the Scotch industry. They developed it. But it's an important part of bourbon. You lose part of your product year over year. It's a very unusual industry in that we have that concern.
And the location is very important too of the barrels, because we were talking earlier about, you just got a 26-year-old Willet, and I was lucky enough to taste it, and I was like, man, this tastes like a 12-year-old bourbon. It doesn't taste. And Drew was like, well, it's been sitting on our low warehouse in the corner with no sun for 26 years. So that's why.
It makes a huge difference. Yeah, your temperature, your fluctuations in temperature, your extremes of heat play a big role in that. Those older bourbons that still taste good, they've been handled very special. Somebody, exactly like your example, that somebody's been monitoring them in a very unusual place. It's the only way that it works. If you look at your typical 5, 6, 7-story warehouse, at the bottom where it's very cool, comparably, your bourbons take longer to reach maturity, but you can get them to go longer and get some really interesting and complex flavors out of them over time. The ones at the top, extreme Kentucky summer heat, and you magnify that by the chimney effect of these warehouses, trapping all that heat up at the top, they're not going to last as long. The barrels, the wood just takes damage from that heat. You get faster extraction, you get faster oxidation, but you don't necessarily get as much nuance over time. And people explore those in different ways. Makers famously, they want consistency. They don't care, so they move their barrels around. Horribly inefficient, but they want to eliminate.
They should look into the boxes.
Yeah.
Turn into like an Amazon, facility.
Yeah, exactly. Have the robots start moving them.
Yeah.
So I guess when we talk about the aging and the rick houses in general, is there anything unique about the rick houses that make them necessarily for, actually holding barrels, aging bourbon versus just like, I don't know, I'll just go buy a tough shed and, age something in it. Like what would be the difference? Or like, what am I getting out of having a specially built rick house?
Yeah, there's, volume is one thing. I mean, when you're trying to get, 50,000 barrels in one building, you kind of need to do it custom. But beyond that, they are designed, almost all of them, with a ricking system. And this is the beautiful photos that you see. And so when somebody walks into one of these warehouses and immediately they've got to take a picture to go up on Instagram of the long rows of the facing barrels and the barrel heads with the logos on them and the space between the ricks. This system was designed to encourage airflow between the barrels. So regardless of the exterior structure, which is less important unless you're heat cycling your warehouse, it's basically there to keep the wind and rain off. The shell is. The interior is designed to make sure you have good airflow around the barrels, and so all the barrels are accessible. You need to check on your barrels regularly. You got to have somebody go in there, look at all of them, or at least look at a pretty good representative sample. Make sure you're not having leaks. Make sure that they're maturing properly. Be able to get to them to sample them. People don't realize how often barrels are access to get samples over their lifetimes. It's not like, if you're going to produce a 8-year-old product, that at 8 years, you just go grab all your barrels. They need to be monitored as they're getting there. And even because an 8-year-old product, that's your minimum, you might throw some 9s and 10s in there because they didn't quite reach the flavor profile that you were looking for at the time. So a ricking system and the warehouses are designed to provide efficiency to the process and the chemistry that's happening, and to provide a capacity for the employees to get to the barrels. Now, it's still a pain in the butt to remove a barrel. These things are really heavy, full about 550 pounds. So even if it's evaporated half of that, it's still going to be 250, 275. And there's no shortcut. If you need to get a barrel out of the middle of the rick house, you got to move every other barrel that's in front of it, pull it out. You're probably going to immediately pop a new barrel into its place and then roll them back in. That's why you go into the warehouses and you look at the ages and the lot numbers that are on the barrels. They're going to be all over the place because even though they may have gone in when the warehouse was first filled, in sequential order, all on the same dates initially, they came ready at different times, and the blank spaces got filled in while they were accessible, while all the other barrels were moved out of the way with whatever was ready that day. So that's why you see this spectrum of ages in every single warehouse.
So it's highly inefficient.
Highly inefficient.
Yeah, I was about to say, I was like, because you would think that. I mean, you look at most people that have like a Coke dispenser inside of their refrigerator, right? You put the new ones on top, and then at the very bottom, you pull it out, and then it just kind of like filters out and you get the next one, right?
Yeah, very often on the backside of the barrels where the consumers can't see it, there's a barcode because there are massive databases for keeping track of every single barrel in every single warehouse. It's a huge job. There are a lot of people who are employed just to track all the barrels that are aging in Kentucky.
Mm-hmm. And then some algorithm that says like, all right, these are the 60 barrels we needed to go and taste today.
If it could be made into an algorithm, they would have done it. It's literally just monitoring and watching and saying, what's the next ones to test, and what ones that we decided weren't ready yet do we want to go back and revisit? And it's every barrel handled individually.
Yeah, I got the lucky opportunity a couple weeks ago into one of Willett's warehouses, and he's like, let me show you these barrels. And he's like, oh, it might be over here. No, it might be over. Oh, there it is. That's the one. And then we drill into it, and he's like, oh, yeah, this one's good, but it still needs about 6 more years. And you're like, really? I think you should bottle it now.
You want your Willet now, yeah.
But yeah, it's like you said, those structures are incredible because you're walking on these wood planks, and I'm like, God, I feel like I'm going to fall through the floor.
Yeah. And the flooring, for the consumer facing warehouses, it's all nice and there's railings, but in the real rick houses, it's narrow passageways and it's dark and it's an inefficient process.
It's like a horror movie.
Yeah, it could be.
All right, cool. So I think we hit a lot on the Bourbon 101 and 201. We got a lot of in-depth pieces onto the aging, the making, the barreling. I think we hit on pretty much all portions of it. Great. So I want to talk a little bit, I know we're getting to the top here, but I want to talk a little bit about the tasting, right?
Yeah.
So because I guess this is we talked about all the making of it, but I guess the tasting is really where it all happens, right?
And there's a lot to it. I mean, my first tasting experience, as I talked about, was not a pleasant one with bourbon. And it wasn't until I was sitting there with Chris Morris and he was like, let me show you. And that was eye-opening for me. So one of the things that's really important to me when I'm leading a tasting is I cover the glasses before I start, before anybody sits down. Nobody gets to it until I let them, because people are going to dive in. They're going to do it wrong. It's going to burn. They're going to mess up their nose. They're going to lose the beauty that went into the craft and the experience of these products. So what I always start with, get a quality glass if you can. I love a Glencairn. That's my personal, but there are a lot of good quality glasses. If you got to use a plastic cup, so be it, but there are other options. Give your bourbon a little swirl. That breaks the surface tension and starts to release some of the aromatics, and then don't nose it. It's hard. You got to resist this beautiful bourbon sitting there.
See, I jump into the nosing.
Yep. And once you get used to it, you can. But for people who are really getting into bourbon initially, or if you are a bourbon enthusiast and you love it and you've been drinking it for 10 years or 20 years and you want to introduce somebody to it, remember they're going to have a barrier to entry. It's not going to be easy for them to pick up the glass and get the same thing that you get. So after you swirl it, you let it rest, you let it evaporate off some of that alcohol bloom. And then the way I know is there's two different techniques. Either breathe in through the mouth and out through the nose, which is a little awkward breathing technique, but works extremely well. What that does is that pulls all of the vapors into your mouth and then traps the alcohol, and then the aromatics go across your nose so you don't burn your olfactory sense. The other technique is to breathe in through your nose, but you start with your glass at your chin, which looks very awkward, but totally works. And then you breathe in gently through your nose and raise the glass from your chin to your nose. I always demonstrate it first because it looks funny. And I want people to say,
sounds
no,
like a meditation technique.
Oh, and it might as well be. I mean, you're meditating on the quality of this bourbon right there. And then you'll stop breathing in through your nose if you start to detect any burn. So that really helps people get past that. And a lot of people who come from wine, you stick your nose in the glass, you breathe in, 12% alcohol, it's not going to hurt you. But bourbon, especially these high proof things, the barrel strength stuff, that can have so much alcohol coming off it, you can just burn out your olfactory sense, and you got to wait 20 minutes to detect anything. So I always recommend nose gently to get started. And when you taste bourbon for the first time, either the day or first time in your life, it's going to be hot. Every bourbon is hot, no matter how smooth it is, no matter what the marketing talks about, no matter what your friends say about how amazingly smooth this bourbon is. No, it's going to be hot. At least 40% alcohol. And most of your quality ones are a higher proof. Bottle and Bond, you hit that. That's got to be 100 proof exactly. I mean, there's a reason for that. So what I recommend is first sip, hold it in the mouth 10, 15 seconds, do the Kentucky Chew with it, swallow it. And I always remind my audience, first sip's hot. And we don't talk about flavor. Somebody's going to cough. Yeah, it's fine. Let it go. Have a sip of water. We're giving our palate time to adjust to the high proof nature, all that alcohol. Then we're going to take a second sip. And now we're going to look at some of the initial flavors. And this is where people's eyes start to light up a little bit, where they're like, oh, wait, there is flavor here. There's something other than alcohol. And then after a minute, we do the third sip. And that's where we get into the nuanced flavors. And that's called the triple sip technique. And that's the way a lot of professionals do it and a lot of judges do it. In fact, certain judges that I know within the whiskey community start their palates on vodka just to get them adjusted to high proof before they go into judging the whiskeys.
Or just to remind them how much better bourbon is.
There's that. Yeah. Oh, this is flavor. Oh, I get this.
Yeah.
And then you can go deep into it beyond there. There's different ways of constructing flights to learn more. There's different ways of using culinary aids to set people's palates with different flavors. So, chocolate and bourbon is a great combination. A little dark chocolate is going to help you pull out the chocolate notes in bourbon.
Yeah, so I guess with that is there a lot of things that you would pair for a tasting that you would recommend? Was it maybe types of cheese or peanuts
Cheetos.
or Cheetos, a bunch of Cheez-Its?
Well, I like to use the flavor wheel tasting developed by Wheat & Michael. This was developed for Woodford Reserve, and it works best for that. But there are variants that work for different other bourbons, and it's a great platform to begin thinking about. Cheese works beautifully. Now, I always get a slightly older cheese. The initial flavor wheel plate was developed with a 2-year-old Parmesan, which is a little drier, a little concentrated fats, concentrated salts. And that helps set up the palate by the fat sits on the tongue and keeps some of the alcohol off, makes it a little easier and a little gentler. And it's good to start a tasting with something fairly salty. Causes salivation, increases the oxygen to the tongue. It really makes your whole sense of taste heightened. And then we would move on to...
So it's not just for your spaghetti anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's for bourbon. And we move on to toasted nuts, which brings out the nutty barrel characters that are in there. Fruit obviously has a place. And fruit, you can go deep with fruit and bourbon. Usually cherry notes are the ones that people get pretty easily in bourbon. So I like to incorporate a dried cherry. But there's nothing wrong with banana because there's a lot of bourbons have a strong banana character. In fact, that's the aroma that most people remember from a bourbon distillery is the banana note in the air. So I like to incorporate that one. And then citrus is a natural. You can do, orange, lemon, lime, grapefruit. And each of those will bring out different flavors in the bourbon. This is why whiskey sours are so popular. It's because those are flavor sets that match. And then chocolate's just your natural close.
So how did you train your palate to be able to pick out certain senses when you're nosing or anything like that? For anybody that's wondering, like, how do I really, I want to better myself in regards of, not just smelling it, because that's typically what I do. I go, oh, it smells like bourbon.
Yeah. Because I've drank a lot, but I still haven't gotten all these nuances and stuff.
It's actually a lot of work. It's a lot of sitting there and learning flavors. So I try to cook a lot, and I try to just refresh my palate memory on different flavors as I go along. And then as an executive bourbon steward, I got a sensory kit. So it has a bunch of different aroma isolates in it. So if I need to think of, what is a banana and I don't have one handy, I can go to that and use that to refresh my palate memory. And it's getting a kit, or it's putting bourbon with food. If you're having dinner, just have a bourbon and look at what's on the plate and think about, are these tasting notes that I might have found in a bourbon, and if you're having, get to the dessert, you get like tiramisu, there's beautiful chocolates and creams in a lot of bourbons. Like take a bite, take a sip of the bourbon, go back and forth, see what comes out for you. It's just practice. Inside the big distilleries, there are very long, very involved palate training programs, just like you have in culinary centers. There are blind tastings. There are fault identifications. There are, as Elizabeth McCall was on here recently talking about the triangle tasting, where two are the same and one is different. Can you find it? You can set those up for yourself, for your buddies. Have people over, do a blind tasting. Say, ABC. Figure out which one is different, and just practice with your palate, paying attention to it, learning. There's no shortcut. That's the process.
All right. Awesome. Well, with that, I think there's one last question I kind of want to throw at you. It might be a curveball.
Oh,
so people like Ryan and I, where we think we know everything, but I'm sure we've even learned a lot more today. What do you think is something that most people who think they're, I don't want to say bourbon aficionados,
well educated,
bourbon snobs, whatever it is, that they necessarily have either a misperception about or don't know about in regards of either bourbon process, production, tasting, whatever it is?
I think very often they forget how much work it is to make bourbon. It is crazy, difficult jobs out there. I was fortunate to train in production for a little bit at Woodford Reserve, and it is amazing to me what those guys do day in and day out. At every level of the production process, sourcing the grains, checking on the fermentations, managing the yeast, running the stills, checking the stills so often, rolling barrels around. And then all of the sensory that goes into it. When somebody puts out a bourbon, any distiller anywhere, they're proud of their product. They've put so much into creating a flavor profile that people are going to enjoy. And I just, when I've got a glass, I try to remember that. I try to remember all the people who put effort and time and love and care into this product. And
damn, now I feel like shit. For the ones that said, this sucks crap.
Hey, sometimes you got to be honest about it too. And the other thing is, I think that as you get deeper into the bourbon community, it's easy to forget people outside the community won't have your appreciation for bourbon built in. And if you're introduce them gently, let them add a bunch of water, let them bring the proof down, let them have food with it, give it time. Nobody jumps into the deep end of the pool. So as we're bringing new people on board into bourbon enthusiasm, let it be gentle.
I can tell you firsthand, I made that mistake a couple weeks ago. A friend came in town and I took him down to Bardstown. We toured the distilleries, and then he likes bourbon, but he drinks it with bourbon and ginger. I'm like, oh, you got to get past that crap. So I'm like, we're over here, we got some of the best bourbons ever. And he's like, man, I just can't get it.
Yep.
I just don't get it. And I'm like,
takes a while.
Well, I probably rushed it. So
there you go. I guess another question I want to pose to you. Maybe I have two. One, you have a lot of tastings, and then people leave, and they leave with a better appreciation of whatever it is. Now, what do you tell them, or like, what are the first like 2 to 3 bottles that you need to go out and buy and be able to taste side by side to be able to really notice the differences in either column still versus pot still, or this kind of high rye versus low weeded, whatever. So like, what's a good way to kind of tell people this that are really getting into this? Like, you want to figure out and understand the nuances between different types of radically different flavor profiles. Like, what are those bottles that you go and tell them to choose?
Well, that's a great question. I always try to recommend big, easy to find products. So if we're looking at a weeded bourbon, I just go to Maker's Mark. It's a top selling product. It's available most places in the world. If I'm going to be looking at rye, there's no reason not to look at, Evan Williams. Also, huge seller. Most people are going to be able to find it. So from my perspective, as much as we could go really deep and we could go into specific releases and specific vintages and limited editions and get, go down a lot of different rabbit holes with it. I always try to get people to start with whatever they can find wherever they are in the world. Whatever bottles are on the shelf, and then just go on the internet and look. Like, it's really easy now to look up grain recipes, look up distillation techniques, look up ages, and just have that in front of you. Pick whatever 2-3 bottles you've got in your cabinet, pour them side by side, look up the differences. One thing that I do recommend doing is, especially at the beginning, is eliminating a proof difference. Like, if you can, you look up the formulas online, get yourself some purified water, bring everything down to 80. Because the proof difference is huge, and it's a very confusing difference for people who aren't used to drinking high proof spirits. But once you've eliminated that, whatever you've got, whatever you can get access to at the beginning, when you're still learning, there's no reason to jump in the deep end.
Right. What's the most common question people ask you when you host a tasting?
Oh, they always ask me what my favorite is, and I just can't do it. I mean, there's so many amazing. We live in the golden age of bourbon. There's so many amazing products. Once you can get into it, once you can start tasting the different flavor profiles, once you understand wheat versus rye and column differences and what people were thinking and different batching techniques, it's so exciting.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, Tim, I want to say thank you again for coming on the show today. This was great, kicking off our Newbies Month. So I want to give you a chance to be able to plug your website, how to get in contact with you, and everything like that.
If you want to reach me, my website is distilled-living.com. My email address is just my first name on the front of that. So tim@distilled-living.com. And I am Distilled Living on almost all the socials. So reach out to me there. On my website, I have a list of upcoming events. You can see where I'm going to be leading tastings. And if you'd like to hire me for a private function, you can do so that way too.
There you go. 1-800-Tim Knittel.
That's right. Not yet.
Yeah. Appreciate you coming on. If it wasn't Tuesday at 1:00, I would say I would be super excited to do a tasting note party with you.
Hey, next time I'm up in Louisville, we're going to do it. We'll do a full-on palate training tasting.
We'll do it right. Sounds great. I'm in.
Yeah, let's do it. No, that was super informative, and it kind of got me pumped up about bourbon again. So I'm ready to go try some more. But no, appreciate the time. I know it's a long journey for you, and I'm sure the guests will love this too.
Yeah. Again, thank you again. If you want to make sure you like what you hear, subscribe to us on Patreon, help support the show. That's patreon.com/Bourbon Pursuit. Follow us on all those great social media channels as well at Bourbon Pursuit. And we're going to have a steady new stream of a few podcasts coming at you with all kinds of introductions back into bourbon basics. So get ready for a good month coming up. So I guess that's it. We'll see you all next week.
See you next time.